Hello, I'm Justin Wolf, Associate Professor of History at Tulane University. I'm a specialist in Central American history and have worked in the area for nearly 30 years. In this module, I hope to give you a brief overview of Central American history from just before the encounter with the Spanish through to the beginning of the 21st century, highlighting historical legacies, economic transformations, politics, and U.S. Central American relations. As a historian, my focus is on people, places, relationships, and actions. What do people do, when, and why? And what influence do these past events have on the future? What are their legacies? Human history is fundamentally intertwined with the environment. We can and do alter our environment, but it always imposes limitations on us and our actions. We build dams, roads, canals. We divert water. We flatten the earth. We dig up land and fill in swamps. We bring agriculture to the deserts, and we build cities in the forests. These frequently bring short and medium-term gains, but often with long-term and unaccounted for costs. And sometimes the short-term or upfront costs are too high, even when there are acknowledged long-term benefits. The Isthmus of Central America, which today is formed by Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, extends about 1,100 miles. Central America is at its widest along the Honduras-Nicaragua border, about 300 miles across, and its narrowest place runs along the route of the Panama Canal, about 40 miles across. It is divided unevenly from a western zone to an eastern one. Along the west are low mountains and highland valleys suitable for sedentary agriculture and the kinds of larger-scale settlements this enables. It was here the Spanish encountered the largest and most hierarchically structured indigenous communities, which they would exploit for labor and taxation over the next 300 years. To the east, the land slopes down to lowland jungles, pasture lands, and swamps, which accommodated much smaller communities of slash and burn farmers and hunter-gatherers. But because these communities had only temporary settlements and lacked the social complexity of highland natives, the Spanish never exerted systematic control in the east. Nicaragua is the largest country in Central America, occupying about 50,000 square miles, about the size of Alabama or North Carolina, but it's also the least densely populated, at 134 people per square mile. El Salvador, at just over 8,000 square miles, about the size of New Jersey, is the smallest country, but also the most densely populated, at 812 people per square mile. Guatemala has the largest population, estimated for 2020 at about 18 million, while Panama and Costa Rica have the smallest, at 4.3 and 5 million people respectively. The encounter with the Spanish, beginning in 1500, proved devastating for indigenous people. Between 90 and 97% died over the next 50 years, primarily from European diseases to which the indigenous had no resistance. In part because of this population loss, but also because the region lacked gold and silver that made Mexico and the Andean region so attractive to the Spanish, Central America took on a status as a backwater of the Spanish Empire. Guatemala, with the largest indigenous population and most attractive climate, became the center of a newly created Kingdom of Guatemala. It had produced the greatest wealth in the region, attracted the richest and most powerful families, and housed the offices of regional imperial authority. As you moved southward in the kingdom, the size of the indigenous population shrank, and the status of backwater grew. Thus, despite the implications of its name, Costa Rica, or Rich Coast, was the poorest, least populated, and least important territory in the kingdom. Nicaragua, although thinly populated and with limited resources, was home to the largest cattle herds in Central America and provided relatively easy access to both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Indeed, Nicaragua, like Panama, had been known since the early 1500s as a place across which one could connect the oceans. As the Spanish consolidated their rule throughout the Americas, they established a highly structured and hierarchical society built on the privileges of nobility and infused with an antipathy for racial and religious difference. To manage this racially mixed society, the Spanish developed what they called the Sistema de Castas, or caste system, a set of laws and practices that labeled everyone according to a racial hierarchy and discriminated against non-Spaniards based on their place in that hierarchy. By the early 1700s, larger and faster ships allowed the region's bulkier goods, like cacao and indigo, to compete with silver. Central America's economies, especially Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, grew rapidly. But divisions among the provinces began to intensify as Guatemala tried to assert itself as imperial center and the other regions sought more autonomy and control over their newfound wealth. During this time, the indigenous population began to recover its size, while the population of mixed descent people, who the Spanish called mestizos and mulattos, also grew. Census figures from the end of the 18th century show that Guatemala had a 63% indigenous population, El Salvador a 51% indigenous population, Honduras just 27%, Nicaragua 46%, and Costa Rica just 9%. In Central America, more than elsewhere in the Spanish Empire, mixed descent people came to be known as Ladinos, a kind of catch-all term for non-indigenous. It retains this meaning today and is often used interchangeably with mestizo. Current statistics suggest that the indigenous population has plummeted in Central America. Today, Guatemala's indigenous population is listed as just 41%, El Salvador's just 10 to 12%, Honduras 7%, Nicaragua 9%, and Costa Rica 2%. These figures, however, particularly for El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, represent not the disappearance of indigenous people per se, but rather a mix of assimilation and these states' resistance to recognizing indigenous people in their censuses. By the early 1800s, Spain fell into crisis as Europe succumbed to the spread of Napoleon's armies. Talk of independence from Spain began to circulate, but more importantly, Enlightenment ideas of equality, individual rights, democratic practices, and popular sovereignty crept into local debates. Rebellions erupted across Mexico and parts of South America, and when Mexico finally declared its definitive independence in 1821, so too did Central America. Spanish colonialism ended without bloodshed in Central America, but that didn't make becoming independent societies any easier. Monarchy was replaced with constitutional republicanism, and voting rights were extended to most men, be they of indigenous, black, or mixed-race descent. Each of the old provinces became independent nations, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, but they also tried to forge a single Central American federation. But these ideas butted up against centuries of racism, inequality, and regional disputes, and did not go unchallenged. Civil wars erupted throughout the region as wealthy elites tried to preserve their position and privilege, while mixed-race peoples, as the emerging majority, demanded seats at the table equivalent to their numbers. Indigenous communities, by contrast, resisted the state's new assimilationist policies. And while all of the countries understood the need for a patria grande of Central America, understanding how weak and small they were by themselves, disputes over the seat of power, taxation, and allocation of state resources pulled against the Federation from the beginning. By the 1870s, a pattern of stability began to emerge. The Central American Federation had collapsed, and the chaos and bloodshed of the civil wars led to calls for order and a focus on the economy. This, however, tended to pit non-indigenous people against indigenous communities who continued to seek autonomy and to retain their lands and cultural practices. The legacies of colonialism and its creation of a diverse but fundamentally unequal and racist society sit at the heart of these disputes, shaped the conflicts of the 20th century, and continue to do so today. Throughout the colonial period and into the early decades of the independence period, most of the land in Central America was held as communal property, planted in corn, beans, and squash, the key staples of the indigenous diet. Cattle ranches covered much of central Nicaragua as well as parts of Honduras and Guatemala. Plantations of cacao, indigo, and sugar also dotted the entire region. By the 1870s, however, ideas about the production of tropical agricultural exports, particularly coffee and bananas, began to transform the region as an oligarchy of leading planters took control of the government. In Central America, the most fertile coffee lands tended to be found along the volcanic slopes in lands cultivated by indigenous communities. Through processes of land privatization, sales, and expropriation, these increasingly passed into the hands of Latinos. Many indigenous people tried to participate in this new economy, but lacked the capital to survive the increasingly cutthroat competition. These shifts forced more and more subsistence farmers into wage labor and tenant farming. It weakened domestic food production and produced unprecedented poverty and economic inequality. Spaniards and Latinos had always placed indigenous people on a lower rung of the social and political hierarchy, but now they increasingly were seen as impediments to modernization and outsiders to the nation. The development of a large-scale banana industry in Central America had different but no less important ramifications. Production for the global marketplace required enormous tracts of land, the development of railroads and port facilities, and huge labor pools. Unlike coffee, which flourished in the western highlands, banana production expanded along the lowland east in the region historically ignored by the Spanish during the colonial period. Investment in this area was expensive and risky, which led most countries to offer huge land and infrastructure concessions to foreign investors. The most powerful of these was the United Fruit Company, which developed a near monopoly in the region on its way to becoming the largest agricultural enterprise in the world and the largest employer in Central America. Banana production attracted lots of workers from throughout the region, but also relied on large-scale migration, particularly from the West Indies. Over decades, this led to substantial Afro-Central American communities all along the Caribbean side of Central America. Central America's export-led economy expanded rapidly between 1870 and 1900, growing even faster as banana consumption boomed between 1900 and 1929. Cities expanded with new architecture and infrastructure. Urban dwellers experienced new benefits like paved roads, streetcars, piped water and sewage systems, public parks, and theaters. Rural workers, by contrast, lived in ever-growing precarity, many starting to migrate to the cities in hopes of work and opportunity. This era is often portrayed as the arrival of capitalism into the region, and that was certainly true in terms of the country's trade with the US and Europe. But domestically, the expansion of trade was aided by non-market state intervention, including vagrancy and forced labor laws, expanded rural policing, land expropriation, and export subsidies. Specialization in just a few export crops spurred economic growth, but it also left Central America unprepared to weather the storm winds of the global economy. The worst such calamity came with the Great Depression beginning in 1929. Prices of most tropical commodities dropped by 60% from their pre-depression average, and this began a reckoning with the costs of specialized production, the lack of industrial development, and government policies that impoverished the countryside. Students, peasants, urban workers, and even members of the military rose up against the planter oligarchy, calling for the development of the domestic economy, land reform, and protection of workers' rights. The most profound of these movements occurred in Guatemala in 1944, leading to a period of democratic governance and social and economic reforms. But driven by Cold War fears of the spread of communism, the U.S. organized a coup in 1954, which overthrew the elected government and precipitated military control for the next 4 decades. This kind of intervention was not new to Central America. The U.S. had been actively involved in the region's affairs since the mid-19th century, but its willingness to use military force took on an urgency that matched the growth of U.S. investment in the region. In the 1880s, the U.S. began its first serious effort to build a canal across Nicaragua, but abandoned this when it took over the French effort in Panama. Beginning in 1903, the U.S. negotiated a concession in perpetuity for a 10-mile wide zone in which to build an interoceanic canal. Completed in 1914 at a cost of nearly $375 million, it represented the largest U.S. investment in Latin America. In 1912, the U.S. began a 2-decade-long military occupation of Nicaragua, during which time it took control of Nicaragua's financial institutions and military, replacing the latter with a new National Guard. The U.S. appointed head of the National Guard, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, and his sons, Luis and Anastasio, known as Tachito, would rule Nicaragua for the next 45 years. The Cold War ushered in dictatorships everywhere in Central America except Costa Rica. There, its smaller population, more equitable distribution of land, and a lack of U.S. intervention in its history permitted it to sustain a democratic government. After the military coup of 1948, the new government abolished the military, redistributing its forces into the newly created National Police. This tended to produce a shifting loyalty within the police, as leaders came and went with each election. This made it harder for the police to intervene in Costa Rican politics, but it also promoted corruption among the police. The dictatorships did little to fix the underlying problems of poverty and inequality in Central America, but their use of violence on the one hand and investment in urban development and infrastructure and promotion of small-scale industrial production on the other helped to quell resistance. Still, following the Cuban Revolution of 1959, and because the military closed off space for public criticism and democratic practice, revolutionary guerrilla movements began to take root. By the late 1970s, the EGP, or Guerrilla Army of the Poor, in Guatemala, the FSLN, or Sandinista National Liberation Front, in Nicaragua, and the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front in El Salvador, were engaged in large-scale civil wars. In 1979, the Sandinistas led a wave of popular opposition to defeat Anastasio Tachito Somoza and the National Guard, beginning a revolutionary government that would rule from then until 1990, when it lost the democratic election to a U.S.-supported opposition coalition. In El Salvador and Guatemala, the militaries and revolutionaries fought to a stalemate that would eventually lead to peace settlements in the early 1990s, but not before the death of more than 75,000 civilians in El Salvador and 200,000 in Guatemala. The highest death tolls came in the early 1980s, when both governments enacted policies known as draining the sea that the fish swim in. That is, the systematic destruction of rural communities and conflict zones, through burnings, massacres, and bombings, in hopes of eliminating popular support for the guerrillas. In El Salvador, the virulent anti-communism of the military and related death squads expressed a total dehumanization of any opposition to the dictatorship. Torture and murder were meted out to guerrillas and suspected activists, but also to leaders of the centrist Christian Democratic Party. On March 28, 1980, a death squad leader murdered Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero while he was leading Mass. A week later, some 100,000 people gathered in San Salvador's main plaza for Romero's funeral, only to have it turn into bedlam as forces in the National Palace threw smoke bombs and shot into the crowd. 30 to 40 mourners died. 8 months later, members of the National Guard raped and murdered 4 American churchwomen. From here, the violence would only intensify. In Guatemala, the military's tactics became increasingly genocidal, focused primarily on the indigenous Maya. If in the late 19th century they were seen as impediments to modernization, in the 1980s they became impediments to a unified Guatemala. During the 16-month rule of General Efraín Ríos Montt, over 300 Mayan villages were completely destroyed. Some 70,000 Mayans were murdered or disappeared, and over 200,000 sought refuge across the border in Mexico. Despite the intensity of the war in the 1980s, the governments proved incapable of victory over the insurgents. Exhausted by the violence, struggling under the weight of mounting debt and economic downturns, the presidents of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica negotiated the Central American Peace Accords, which provided a framework for peace and a return to democracy in the region. Peace in El Salvador and Guatemala would come in the early 1990s, but not until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and declining U.S. interest in the region. In El Salvador and Nicaragua, the former revolutionaries in the FSLN and the FMLN transformed themselves into competitive political parties. In these countries, but also throughout Central America, new social movements also emerged, particularly centered on indigenous and Afro-descendant identity and representation, environmental justice, and women's rights. Many of these movements learned their organizing strategies from the radical movements of the 1970s and 80s, but reframed them towards tangible goals rather than abstract revolutionary change. The wars may have stopped in Central America, but the underlying problems of poverty and inequality remained. In fact, in many ways, these worsened as economic policies demanded by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, such as a focus on the expansion of exports and free trade, massive budget cuts, and privatization of public companies, have made day-to-day survival even more difficult. Narco-trafficking, gang violence, and political corruption have flourished in this environment, weakening state sovereignty and provoking mass migration. A return to the 19th century idea of economic specialization has also spurred anti-environmental practices like deforestation and open-pit mining. It also has promoted a focus on cheap labor production in maquiladoras, or modern-day sweatshops. Deforestation in particular has grown rapidly over the last 15 years, and as sea levels rise and hurricanes become more frequent and more deadly, Central America finds itself sacrificed as the canary in the coal mine to climate change and global warming.